Hey everyone, welcome back to the Michael Lofton Show on Reason and Theology. So, with the passing of Pope Francis a couple days ago, there have been a lot of people talking about who the next Pope might be. For me, I feel it's a little too early to start having those discussions, but since so many people are weighing in on the question and having those conversations, whether I agree with them or not, here we are. I've decided to go ahead and, you know, speak on the matter a little earlier than I would prefer. I've been seeing numerous people in comment section, Twitter, Facebook, everywhere, all over social media, um, saying that they hope and even think that Cardinal Sarah will be the next pope. And I am going to do a stream talking about who are some likely candidates for the papacy. But that's going to be in a different stream. What I'm going to do today is focus specifically just on Cardinal Sarah. And we'll discuss some of the reasons why the College of Cardinals might want to go with Cardinal Sarah and some of the reasons why they might say, no, we're going to pass on them. So what I'm going to do is examine how they are probably going to analyze it rather than how perhaps I would evaluate the situation or how even you might evaluate a candidate. We're going to kind of look at it through their eyes, and we're going to do so by taking a look at Cardinal Sarah on a number of positions, and then we're going to evaluate whether or not the College of Cardinals would be likely to vote for him or unlikely. So, all of that is what is in store for today. But I want to remind you before we dive into the details, you need to hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. Also, hit the bell for notification because a lot of people don't know when I go live, and that's because they're not hitting the bell for notification. Also, you need to hit the like button. The more people who like the stream, the more people who will be reached with the content. So if you want other people to see the video, make sure to do your part. Okay. So let's go ahead and dive in. Now, there is an interesting resource that was sent to me by a patron. I'm not necessarily giving my entire approbation to all of the content or evaluation on it, but it is called collegeofcardinalsreport.com, and it does have some useful summary information about various cardinals, including Cardinal Sarah. So we're going to kind of use this as a basis for our discussion today, and considering will Cardinal Sarah be the next pope, in addition to some information that I was able to retrieve on my own. So, Cardinal Sarah is actually the prefect emeritus of the Congregation for Divine Worship, now Dicastery, for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments. And so, what that means is he was the guy who was mainly over the liturgy and making sure that liturgies are done right and evaluating questions related to the liturgy that might be submitted to him by the bishops. And so questions on the liturgy during COVID, those were submitted to him. And we're going to take a look at some of the things that he said about it. But he's emeritus, so he's no longer over that dicastery. Cardinal Roche, I believe, is the one who's prefect now. But he was prefect for a few years there, appointed by Pope Benedict XVI. Okay, so he's from Guinea. He is 79 years old, born in 1945. Voting status, he is still of voting age, but I think he only has like, let's see here, about a month or so, right? Whenever he turns 80, he will no longer be eligible to vote for the next pope. However, I suspect the College of Cardinals will very likely, most likely, 99% likely, be voting on the next pope before he turns 80. So he will likely participate in that. Okay. So Cardinal Sarah, traditional and orthodox minded, Former senior Vatican official whose prophetic witness, personal sanctity, and literary works have brought him a wide and devoted following across the world. He's co-authored books with Benedict XVI, has Benedict writing forwards to some of his other books. It has some, basic summary information about him. We're going to skip forward just a little bit here. Benedict XVI appointed Sarah president of the Pontifical Council Cor Unum in 2010, and then elevated him to a cardinal in the year 2010. So he's been a cardinal since then. And he did take part in the 2013 conclave that elected Pope Francis. Now, in 2014, Francis nominated Sarah prefect of the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Discipline of the Sacraments, and he held that position, appointed by Pope Francis, until 2021. So through the COVID era. Sarah served for a time as a member of congregations for the evangelization of peoples and for causes of saints, and a member of the Pontifical Committee for International Eucharistic Congresses. So he's got a lot of experience at the Vatican, not only as prefect, but as a member in some of these other congregations. He continues to be listed as a member of the dicasteries for the Oriental churches. Those are the Eastern Catholic churches. The causes of saints, evangelization, divine worship, and discipline of the sacraments. He speaks French, Italian, and English fluently. And at the time of the last conclave, Cardinal Sarah hardly figured on papabile lists. That is, people who are eligible to be pope. Now, technically, any male Catholic is eligible, but you know what I mean, likely in eligibility. Serving at the time as president of the Pontifical Council Cor Unum, in which he was quietly helping Benedict XVI to instill greater fidelity to the church's teaching among Catholic charities. He went on to speak with greater authority after Pope Francis appointed him prefect for the Congregation for Divine Worship. And as prefect, he favored a reform of the Reform perspective that basically says, the Council Fathers from the Second Vatican Council gave us the Novus Ordo liturgy. I mean, not technically. That was more given by Paul VI, but they were calling for a reform, and Paul VI carried out that reform and his evaluation of it, and then implemented that in the missal that we have today. However, the reform of the reform says that liturgy, there were some reasons to reform it. There were reasons to reform the Tridentine Latin Mass, as many people call it. But they say, but the reform kind of went too far and ended up maybe discarding some things that should not have been discarded. And also, often the liturgy isn't celebrated correctly. So the reform of the reform perspective says, okay, we don't need to just hit the reset button on the liturgy and just go back to the traditional Latin Mass, but we need to reform the reformed liturgy, reform the Novus Ordo, and make it more in line with maybe something that the Second Vatican Council Fathers were calling for, and something that's a little bit more traditional. So that's what reform of the reform is. And he favored it when he came to the liturgy to revisit and refine the liturgical changes implemented after Vatican II. He placed particular importance on promoting the Mass ad orientem. In fact, you can see an article about that here. This was posted by National Catholic Register in 2016. Cardinal Sarah promotes Advent launch of Ad Orientem liturgical renewal, where he was calling for liturgies to be facing ad orientem, facing liturgical east, because the notion is that this is an apostolic tradition, and also Jesus will return from the east, and so the liturgy faces in anticipation the direction from which Jesus will return. And so that's kind of the notion behind ad orientem, as opposed to versus populum, where the priest is facing the congregation. He favored ad orientem, was calling for a return to that, spoke strongly in favor of communion on the tongue, not only in favor of communion on the tongue, but he also spoke as recently as 2018 about communion on the hand as a diabolical attack from Satan on the Eucharist. So he had some very strong criticisms of communion on the hand. We'll look at that here in a moment. So skipping down here just a little bit, let's maybe go to where he weighs in on some of the hot button topics. So where does he stand on, for example, the question of ordaining female deacons? Well, he is opposed to it. They note in the book he co authored with Pope Benedict, From the Depths of Our Hearts, Sarah made clear that the female diaconate has been ruled out by the Catholic Church. The possibility of women being ordained as priests or deacons, he notes, was settled definitively by John Paul II in the apostolic letter Ordinatio Sacerdotalis dated May 22nd, 1994. Now, I'm not in favor of female deacons, but I do have to correct that. That is not accurate. Ordinatio Sacerdotalis only excludes women to the priesthood. It says nothing about the diaconate. You might argue that it logically would also necessitate that position, but you would have to somehow demonstrate that. It doesn't, at face value, rule it out. And we've also seen historically female deacons in the West as late as the 1200s, and still in the Eastern churches to one extent or another, Eastern Orthodox and Oriental Orthodox. Again, not in favor of it, but I do have to correct the point. Ordinatio Sacerdotalis does not explicitly rule it out. And so some people will contest that. Okay. But it kind of shows you where he stands on the question of female deacons and then by extension, female priests and female bishops. Okay. Blessing same-sex couples. We're going to look at this in more detail here in just a moment. Let's just go ahead and do it now. Cardinal Sarah, on the question of blessing same-sex couples, he came out with a very strong criticism of Pope Francis's magisterium on the question. Y'all will recall that Cardinal Fernandez, as head of the dicastery for the doctrine of the faith, wrote a declaration, Fiducia Supplicans, allowing for the blessing of homosexual couples in particular cases. And he and also Pope Francis had, clarified that what is meant here by the blessing of the couples is not the union, but the persons, not the relationship with the persons. Whether you agree with that distinction or not, whether you think it's a legitimate distinction or not, irrelevant. I'm just telling you that's what Fernandez and the Pope said. Cardinal Sarah, took a very different perspective on that, and he said that this is heresy. So he ended up taking the perspective that the Catholic magisterium is teaching heresy whenever the Pope approved this document, because Donum Veritatis notes that whenever a congregation like the Dicastery for the Doctrine of Faith, whenever it puts out a declaration and it's approved either in common form or specific form by the Pope, then it becomes part of ordinary papal magisterium. That's Donum Veritatis, paragraph 18, if I recall correctly. So it's very clear whether you agree with Fiducia Supplicans or not, it is magisterial. And so what he ended up saying is, no disrespect to Pope Francis, but this is heresy. So he was basically saying the Catholic magisterium and the papal magisterium teaches heresy through Fiducia Supplicans. And so this was done. Let me share my screen again. Very recently, in fact, in 2023, actually, it may have moved over into 2024. He did so. They cite it as evidence in the same place that I've pointed out to in the past when I did a stream on it. In this interview that Cardinal Sarah gave to this website, if you do a Google translation of it, he says, I must thank the Episcopal conferences that have already done this work of truth, especially those from Cameroon, Chad, Nigeria, whose decisions and firm opposition to the Declaration Fiducia Supplicans I share as my own. Now, that's a whole debate in and of itself. Did they actually oppose it? I know the news said that. I showed, wasn't that clear cut. But okay, here's the big kicker, though. He says, we must encourage other national or regional Episcopal conferences and each bishop to do the same. And then the money quote, in doing so, we do not oppose Pope Francis. So he's being respectful to Pope Francis, but he says, but we firmly and radically oppose a heresy that seriously undermines the church, the body of Christ, because it is contrary to the Catholic faith and tradition. Well, it's nice to say I don't oppose Pope Francis, but, it's like saying, hey, I don't oppose Pope Francis, but Pope Francis is teaching heresy. Okay, I don't know how you make that work, but all right. So, I mean, regardless of what you think about did Pope Francis teach heresy there, is it heretical? Is it something that doesn't, that makes sense and it doesn't amount to heresy? Regardless of where you fall on that, By him tipping his hand and coming out and saying the papal magisterium teaches heresy, you have to look at that from the cardinal's perspective. Do the vast majority of cardinals in the Catholic Church think that the Pope taught heresy with fiducia supplicans? No, they don't. Should they? Different question. Do they? No, they don't. Um, Now, at that point, you got to think of them in conclave. Are they going to want to choose somebody who said the papacy teaches heresy? How would that work? For okay, you make them pope, then now you have an odd situation where one pope teaches the opposite of another pope and has condemned his predecessor as teaching heresy in a veiled and kind way, but has effectively said that he taught heresy. That would be a lot of ammunition for Protestants and critics of Catholicism. And I think the cardinals will consider that. Because think about it. Every other time you had a pope condemn another pope for heresy, for example, Leo II condemning Honorius for heresy, or Hadrian II at Constantinople IV condemning Honorius for heresy, and not just being unclear in a matter or failing to extinguish heresy, but Constantinople IV, the Eighth Ecumenical Council under Hadrian II, says that Honorius taught heresy. And so here you have a situation where, a successor is condemning a predecessor for teaching heresy. How has that worked out for the Catholic Church in the last, I don't know, what, 1400 years since then? It hasn't worked out very well. It's still used as ammunition against the Catholic Church by Protestants to this very day. Many Protestants will still point to that situation as saying the magisterium is unreliable. It can teach heresy one day, and then another pope has to condemn it and overturn it. And so they'll say, you don't even need to follow the magisterium. So there's been it's given a lot of ammunition to the critics of the church. Or think about the situation with the cadaver synod that I covered here on this channel, where you got one pope being condemned by another pope, and all of his acts and ordinations overturned by that pope. But then the next pope goes and condemns that other pope and restores the acts and ordinations of the first pope. But then a fourth pope comes and condemns his predecessor and then restores the condemnation of the first pope. And it's a huge mess. How did that work for the church? Well, it didn't work very well. Many of the critics, including the Protestant reformers, pointed to instances like that in the Western Schism and other situations, and just said, look, this is just entirely unreliable. So whenever you have popes who basically overturn their predecessors in some kind of way, it's never been a good thing for the Catholic Church. And some have argued that Pope Francis overturned some things from John Paul II or Benedict on Sublimorum Pontificum. And many critics have used that against the Catholic Church to say, look, Benedict allowed for the Latin Mass, but now Pope Francis is restricting it, and they'll point to those inconsistencies. And so it weakens the credibility of the church when that happens. So I'm just thinking of this from the perspective of the cardinals, who likely don't believe that Pope Francis taught heresy. Whether you think he did or didn't, different question. Do the cardinals think that? The cardinals who are going to elect a successor, do they think that? No, they don't. They might not like fiducia supplicans, but they don't think it's heresy. So would they vote for somebody who does this? And then they're also going to consider if a cardinal can basically says that the Pope is teaching heresy, does that then give license for future cardinals to say that about Cardinal Sarah and his acts of the magisterium if he were Pope? So if Sarah were made Pope, then the critics of Sarah, critical cardinals, liberal cardinals, would they then be able to also say that Cardinal Sarah is teaching heresy? Well, if Sarah did this to Pope Francis when he was Pope, why couldn't the liberal critics do that to Cardinal Sarah? And I think that the cardinals are going to think that through and realize, okay, you got to factor that in, right? What kind of precedent does this establish to have a cardinal in a very kind way accusing the magisterium of teaching heresy? Does that help? Is that a good precedent, or is that something that needs to be avoided? So I think they're going to take that into consideration, regardless of what your perspective is on Cardinal Sarah, whether he's right or wrong, on Pope Francis, whether he was right or wrong. It doesn't matter. You just got to look at it from the cardinal's perspective. Moving on. So another one is, making priestly celibacy an option. He's opposed to that in the Latin Rite. Obviously, it's already allowed in the Eastern Rite, Eastern Catholic churches. Cardinal Sarah strongly opposes the relaxation of the discipline of priestly celibacy, calling such a move a definitive break with the apostolic tradition that would have serious consequences. I guess what is meant by break with the apostolic tradition is the apostolic tradition that favored that, as opposed to the apostolic tradition that um, allowed for married clergy, like the apostles that were married. Because I mean, in reality, you have both, right? You have married clergy and the discipline of celibacy. You have both of those very early on, and so um, I'm not entirely sure maybe what he means there, but he's opposed to relaxing that in the West. And so, if you got a cardinal who is traditionally minded, they're going to look to things like this. They're going to look to, okay, he doesn't want to ordain females. He doesn't want to bless same sex couples. He doesn't want to make priestly celibacy an option. They're going to look to that. But then you have to ask the question, how many of the cardinals are really traditionally minded? You do have some conservatives, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're traditionally minded, because you could be conservative without being traditional. I'm not saying you can do so consistently. I'm just saying there is a phenomenon of conservative Christians who are non-traditional. Um, Now, how many of those cardinals are actually traditional? Um, Not a lot. Not a lot, right? It's a small minority. There's a very small minority of cardinals who are traditional. There's a larger amount that are conservative to one degree or another. And then there's a decent amount who are, somewhere in the middle and maybe to the left, right? You got to ask, are they going to be looking for these things as somehow something, an item they're looking for in a successor? The majority of cardinals are probably not. This is probably not on their list of things they're looking for. They probably aren't looking for, what's your position on same-sex blessings? What's your position on female deacons? Some of the cardinals will look for that. Don't get me wrong, and this will be in favor of Cardinal Sarah, those who are looking for it. But I think the majority of cardinals are not looking for these items. They're not in the forefront for them. So I don't know if this will be something that is really going to factor in for him. Um, he is against restricting the Latin Mass. In fact, he has spoken of Pope Francis's restrictions of the Latin Mass as satanic. He says it's a diabolical project against the Latin Mass. So he was very vocal in saying not only does Pope Francis teach heresy, but his suppression and restriction of the Latin Mass is demonic and satanic. He's very explicit about that. And you got to think, okay, would the majority of cardinals appreciate that kind of language and perspective? I doubt it. I doubt that this would be in favor of Sirah in their mind. It might be in favor in your eyes, but I'm just saying, in their eyes, I don't think they're gonna see this as a positive. Um, Especially if they're considering, okay, you got we just got, let me just shoot from the hip here. Do you really think the vast majority of cardinals and bishops in the world care about the Latin Mass? No, they don't. You do have some who do. Don't get me wrong. You do. But they're in the minority, and we all know that. What about the cardinals? Again, minority. We all know that. Do the majority of cardinals care about the Latin Mass? No, no. So this probably won't be in favor in their eyes. This would probably work against them, since saying, his predecessor, Pope Francis, was engaging in some kind of diabolic endeavor. I doubt very seriously they're going to be impressed by that, even if they're in favor of relaxing some of those restrictions. Even if they think Pope Francis went too far and they're okay with relaxing it a little bit, I doubt very seriously they're going to go with the position of, yeah, that was demonic for Pope Francis to do that. We don't know on the Vatican-China secret accords, and because we don't have public information about that, and frankly, I don't think that the majority of cardinals are going to care about that. Um, Promoting a synodal church, it's very clear the vast majority of bishops and majority of cardinals are on board with the synodal project. Whatever you think it means is irrelevant. Whatever your perspective is on it is irrelevant. The question is, what do the Cardinals, who are going to elect the next Pope, think about it? The majority of them are in favor of it. So would this be in his favor? Probably not. Probably not. Um, Focusing on climate change, he's obviously in favor of protecting the human environment, but is very opposed to making ecology something that's like front and center. I don't know if that's really going to strike a chord with the majority of Cardinals, right? You got to have 2/3 plus one vote to get a win. Do you think 2/3 plus one vote are really opposed to kind of the ecology agenda of Pope Francis? No, because if they were, they would have spoke up and said something. The only time they halfway made a squeak and a little bit of a sound was with Fiducia Supplicans, and even then they didn't say a whole lot. But that was just with Fiducia Supplicans. Pretty much everything else you didn't hear from the majority of bishops and cardinals in the world when it comes to Pope Francis, which tells you they didn't, even if they didn't agree in some cases, they weren't like really opposed to Pope Francis on those matters. Reassessing Humane Vitae, he's against that. Um, I think there are going to be some cardinals who appreciate that. Certainly, the liberal cardinals won't appreciate that. The question then is, would you really have 2/3 of cardinals who are in favor of reassessing Humane Vitae or opposing it? I would suspect that you would have a lot of cardinals who are in favor of revising Humane Vitae in some kind of way. Um, so I don't think that that's going to be an item that really scores points with the majority. Communion for divorced and remarriage. Well, you got to ask, did the majority of bishops and cardinals really oppose Amor Laetitia on this? No, not really. So regardless of your analysis of that situation, I don't know if that's really going to score some points either. The German synodal way, he's very, very much opposed to it, and that will score some points with your more traditional cardinals. But again, the majority of them, I don't think this is what's on their radar. So what this website does here, it's helpful to a degree, but you'll notice what they're kind of putting here as kind of the main things on the list are likely not going to be things that the Cardinals are thinking about. They say more about the person who compiled this website than it says anything about the Cardinals who are going to be making the decision. The Cardinals who are making the decision, I don't think really care about the majority of these things, for better or worse. And you also got to think they're going to want to have something that's kind of balanced, because look, let's be honest, traditional Catholics are a minority in the Catholic Church. Not even 10% of Catholics in the Catholic Church are traditional. Not even 10%. We're talking less than 10%. Less. And probably way less than 10%. So you're likely not going to see the Cardinals say, okay, let's get somebody traditional that speaks to less than 10% of the Catholic Church. I'm not saying that that's the right move. I'm just telling you, I don't think that that's what they're thinking of. I think they're thinking of, what can we get to kind of balance out the Catholic Church? We got a lot of liberals, we got some traditional Catholics, and we got some conservatives, a lot of people somewhere in the middle. And so they're going to want to find something that kind of, someone that balances that out, someone kind of in the middle. And then you got to ask yourself, is Cardinal Sarrat in the middle? I don't think he's in the middle. I think he's more on the traditional end of the spectrum, and I just don't think the College of Cardinals are looking for somebody traditional, for better or worse. That's just a reality. So given that we have those situations, I don't know. Here's one thing that I did think was interesting. Back in the COVID situation, when Sarah was over the dicastery for divine worship, yes, Sarah said that communion in the hand is a diabolical attack. However, he allowed bishops to restrict and prohibit even communion on the tongue during COVID. He allowed that. So while he personally thinks communion on the hand is a diabolical attack on the Eucharist, as prefect for the dicastery for divine worship, he backed up the bishops who were saying, we're not allowing for communion on the tongue. We're going to mandate communion on the hand. So you remember during COVID, some of them said, no communion on the tongue. We're only doing it on the hand. Sarah sided not with the laity on that question, many of which wanted communion on the tongue. He sided with the bishops and their authority to say during times of a pandemic or war, the popes can basically say you cannot receive communion on the tongue and you have to receive it on the hand. That was Cardinal Sarah who did that. Now, that's going to score some points. Cardinal Sarah will win some points there with the cardinals and bishops who are looking for somebody who's kind of a team player on that point. But then when you couple it with, but more, he said it's a diabolical attack on the Eucharist. He says Pope Francis teaches heresy. He says Pope Francis's agenda against the Latin Mass is demonic. When you consider all that, I don't know if this is going to score a lot of points from in the favor of the bishops. This is, by the way, from the Congregation for Divine Worship and the Sacraments. Whenever Cardinal Roche was asked about the question of can bishops prohibit people from receiving communion on the tongue? And he says, as already been enunciated in the circular letter from Cardinal Sarah from 2020 and approved for publication by the Pope in times of difficulty like pandemics during COVID, bishops and episcopal conferences can give provisional norms which must be obeyed, even clearly as in this case, to suspend whatever time might be required, reception of Holy Communion on the tongue at the public celebration of the Holy Mass. So Cardinal Sarah ruled, okay, during COVID, bishops can say no communion on the tongue, and they can require you to receive it on the hand. A lot of people were not happy about that. A ton of people were not happy about that. But that does go back to Cardinal Sarah. That will score some points, not in favor of what the laity think on that matter, but it will score some points in favor of what some of the bishops and cardinals think about him. But you would have to do it in isolation of everything else that he said. And when they consider those things not in isolation, but in light of other things, I don't know if this is really going to score some points for him. So in my estimation, for better or worse, I don't think Cardinal Sarah will be taken as a serious candidate here. For better or worse, whether he should or shouldn't, I don't think the Cardinals are going to take him seriously there. I think that they're going to look for someone more moderate and probably less vocal than Cardinal Sarah. Cardinal Sarah has been very vocal about these positions. I think they've already seen how vocal Pope Francis was in other areas, and they probably have seen a lot of difficulty that caused. And so they're going to look for somebody who's a little less vocal, who's a little less likely to rock the boat, somebody who will kind of play ball. Is Cardinal Sarah that guy? I don't get the impression he is. He seems like a man of conviction. He's going to stand up what he believes. He's going to be vocal about it. I don't think that's what the Cardinals are looking for. I think they're looking for somebody who's going to keep more of a low profile compared to this last pontificate and also try to placate both sides, the liberals, the traditionals, and everyone in between. Whereas we saw Pope Francis tended to favor one side as against the other. We saw that with that pontificate. I think they're going to want to get away with that, get away from that, and they're going to look for something more balanced. My personal opinion, that's my personal perspective on how they're going to look at this, how it will shake down, what they're looking for. Like I said, in a future stream, I am going to go over in more detail who I think are the top 10 candidates. But I did want to explain to people in advance why I don't think Cardinal Sarah would be in that list for the Cardinals. Not again, in my opinion, I'm just saying what the Cardinals are looking for. So that will be in a later show. I hope this one was helpful to you because I've been seeing a lot of people say, hey, Cardinal Sarah would be a great guy. And hey, that may be the case, but would he really be considered by the men who are going to be making that decision? Because you got to think, I'm not making that decision. You're not making that decision. It's going to be 100, and I think it's down to 33 now because a few said they're not going to be voting. 133 men. And those 133 men probably don't think the way that you or I think on this situation. So you got to get in their mind, how are they going to think about it? So that's what I want to do in the next stream that I cover who may be the next pope. So make sure to tune in for that. Please hit the like button on this one. Hit the subscribe button. Share this with your friends. You see anybody talking about Cardinal Sarah, hey, share this with them. I think this will be thought-provoking. All right. So that's going to do it for today. I'll see you soon. God bless. Hey, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed the content. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, the like button, and if you want to support the channel, visit patreon.com/Reason and Theology.